Welcome to the State of Our Faith, a Faith Commons conversation. I'm George Mason, the founder and president of this nonprofit organization called Faith Commons. It is a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multi-racial organization. We operate from distinct faiths, but toward common goods. And we're going to begin to have these conversations each Sunday at 12:12 to promote the common good. As long as this coronavirus pandemic is going on, we think that maybe some folks would be encouraged by some spiritual learnings that we are experiencing, and also we'll focus on pertinent topics each week that might be helpful in a practical way for you, both individually and in your faith communities. I'm joined by two of our leadership team today. First of all, Rabbi Nancy Kasten, who is our Chief Relationship Officer. And then in a few moments, we're still waiting for Imam Omar Solomon to make it here. He got held up getting a prescription for his brother, I understand. And that's more important, but he'll be with us in a few moments. So let's just begin by tossing it to you, Nancy, and asking, in the Jewish community right now, what are you seeing as being pearls of wisdom as people are wrestling with this very unusual time, the challenges we're facing as a community?
Well, I would say that this is one of those times, George, when all of our communities are faced in some ways with the same challenge. You know, we all encourage our communities and know that individuals feel more secure in times of stress and pain when they can actually reach out to others and engage in service to others. That sometimes that really mitigates the pain that we're experiencing ourselves and the suffering we're experiencing ourselves. But what is happening is that this particular crisis is revealing that our good intentions and the ways that we have been helping others and thereby helping ourselves have been actually covering over some pretty significant gaps in what our society can offer to our communities in terms of a social safety net. And now we are faced with the fact that our typical volunteer efforts, which involve typically physical volunteering as well as financial contributions to in certain ways, that's just not enough, because we're not able to do the same kinds of one-on-one interaction that we were before. That's a major one. But also, I know, for example, the food bank is being stressed because we, individuals, are going to the store, we're stocking up on things. People who have been living paycheck to paycheck, they don't have savings to go stock up on anything. And those who still are lucky enough to have their food stamp or SNAP benefits, even though they've been reduced considerably in the last 4 years, even if they have them, they have to wait for their benefits to arrive, and then they have to go whenever they get them and get a picked over inventory.
Well, you've already moved into the topic of the week, and you were really eager to get us there, I know, as we've been preparing for this conversation, because we're going to be talking about hunger and food insecurity. Before we get fully into that, I think I want to go back to something you said about how in our faith communities, our normal way of being has everything to do with proximity, with our being close to one another as a community that is flesh and bone, where we feel the connection with one another. Now, we talk about spiritual connection, and that's absolutely right, but this is God's world, and we are people who, by our connection to one another physically, really embody this solidarity that we were made for. I think one of the things I'm learning, a friend of mine, a pastor colleague in Baltimore, made a good distinction this week that I think a lot of us are trying to learn, and that is that we're really not experiencing social distancing. We're talking about physical distancing. And we can still be socially engaged, in the words of David Brooks from a column this week, even beyond social engagement, social solidarity, where we can find ways to connect with each other and through forms of spiritual empathy and humanity be connected. And we're finding all sorts of ways to do that. Now, we are separated more than we would be ordinarily, trying to keep that 6 feet of separation even in this conversation. And now there is 6 feet more on this side because our brother, Imam Omar Sullivan, is here with us. Welcome, we're glad you made it.
Thank you so much.
And Omar is special advisor to Faith Commons, and we're delighted because of our friendship and collegiality that we get to share in this time together.
Absolutely.
Omar, we started out talking about what we are learning in our own particular spiritual communities through this pandemic. What things are happening spiritually for your people at this time?
Well, I think that right now everyone is dealing with this new reality, I think, as is the case in every faith community, of having to worship in what would typically be their congregational services in a virtual sense. And so I think there's a lot of loneliness. I think that especially for the elders in our community, that we're coming to the mosque daily because we have 5 daily prayers, and 2-3 of those prayers every day are, several hundred people in many mosques here in Dallas. And so for them having to experience now an added layer of loneliness, and for us having to transition essentially everything to the online space. What has happened is that the anxiety of what's coming with Ramadan in particular, which is about a month from now, I think that's what's really settling in. So there are these pictures, these very grim pictures of Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest mosques in Islam, completely empty. And none of us have ever seen that in our lifetimes. And so the anxiety of Ramadan is really, I think, setting in for people right now, and they're worried about what that's going to look like more than what the present moment looks like.
I think that's an interesting connection that we all have, because it's just weeks away for us to Passover in the Jewish tradition and Holy Week and Easter in the Christian tradition. Passover being a time when families really gather, and neighbors and friends, and they gather in homes, and this is going to be precarious now. You're going to have to do something different about that. Nancy, what are you all thinking?
Well, we're just starting to see people sharing ideas about how to conduct the Passover Seder online or with using Zoom and ways to bring people into the room, using the technology that fortunately we have, and we can connect people that way. This week was the Torah portion where it finishes describing the building of the tabernacle. And one of the things that we know about the tabernacle is that it gets, in the desert, it has to be built every day and then taken down, and then built again and taken down. And so in some ways, this is a metaphor for our spiritual and religious lives right now. The essence of what we're trying to bring into the world, God's presence, remains the same. But we have to do it in different ways, and we have a lot of tools to do that. Going back to that question of loneliness, I think that's, another thing that we can think about. How do we think creatively about helping people feel less lonely? Because we know that even before this, with all of our means to social connection, people were feeling very lonely. That was an epidemic in our
Right.
society in the United States. Now people are calling each other more, they're checking in, they're showing people that they are thinking of them and caring about them in different ways. I saw it from going back to our topic of hunger, the Visiting Nurse Association, they're working on, some of the financial challenges of meeting the need because they need to hire more staff. They can't rely on volunteers to deliver food, even though they're working with the kinds of food they're delivering. But more than that, they need people to volunteer now to call their clients because the social nutrition that they provide is now being lost.
Social nutrition, there's a phrase for you.
Right.
To be feeding the soul is part of the important challenge in our communities. But I loved what your husband, Rabbi David Stern, said this week about how this is a reminder that Judaism is a portable faith. And I think that's true of all of our traditions if we think about it, that we've always been at our best when we've had to adapt and move, not when we settle down. When we settle down, we get nationalistic dreams, we get to thinking we have to carve out borders and boundaries of our faith in harsh ways, and we lose that sense of hospitality, that sense of movement. In your tradition, Ramadan has this fasting that happens all during the daylight hours. And then at night, there is this incredible hospitality that happens with the iftar dinners, right? And in fact, we've had them here at church. How are you and your community thinking about the celebrating of the breaking of the fast each day, and how different that's going to be for you this year?
So, in Ramadan, those that cannot fast are supposed to feed a poor person every day for the day that they cannot fast. Those that are permanently unable to fast. And so Ramadan is supposed to be this combination of developing a sense of empathy and then acting on that empathy, while spiritually feeding the soul at night and practicing that hospitality with one another. But it's a month of great charity. And so I think that as time goes on and as we're looking at how we're going to adapt, the Muslim community is used to charity. It's how do we get out there and serve, right? And so we have some great efforts right now of people that are going out there and delivering aid and thinking about food pantries and things of that sort. And so for a lot of the Muslim community, it's like, okay, well, we can't pray together, we can't eat together in mosques. How do we go out there and help people? But then what makes this such a tricky time for us is obviously having to maintain the standards of hygiene and making sure that we're not contributing to the problem while trying to contribute to the solution. And so it's been hard for me to sort of help my community navigate, those that are used to getting out there and doing things when things like this happen. And for me, this takes me back to Hurricane Katrina. This deeply resembles Hurricane Katrina for me, because at that time, very few people were allowed outside because they still hadn't even done the cleanup yet. So there were sanitary restrictions on being outside. And people just wanted to do good. So we're trying to enable them to do more charity, spend, stay engaged. And I think to your point of social nutrition, I was writing some things in the first few days of this, and some people said, look, can you just come on, even if it's not the Friday sermon, just so we can have that sense of community. It's amazing what a difference it makes when you just log on and when people are virtually in the same space, and on a Google Hangout or a Zoom call, and what that does for people right now. So I think this Ramadan we're going to have to be creative. We're still hoping there's that, the last 10 nights of Ramadan are the most important 10 nights of Ramadan, the last week of Ramadan. So we're still hoping that maybe, just maybe, things will open up to where we could do something in the last week of Ramadan. But, we'll adapt. As you said, we're at our best when we adapt. So
we are at our best when we adapt. Technology, and we're using it right now, as a matter of fact, to connect, is sometimes, I think, in our traditions viewed as kind of an enemy of the faith because it distances people from this human contact. But in this case, maybe we need to see it as a work of the Spirit of God that is bringing us together in new sorts of ways. In our own Christian tradition, as we look toward Easter, that time when families really get together and celebrate new life and new birth of the resurrection of Jesus, that's usually the really big day of the year. It's the most important holiday for Christians because without which we would not have come into being. And there's a tradition in our church where on that Sunday we throw open the shutters of the windows of the church right at the beginning of the service to let the light shine in after a season of Lent that is more about shadows and darkness. A lot of people are already feeling a sense of anticipated loss of not being able to come together and see those shutters flung open. But I saw a meme this week where someone said, whatever Sunday we get back together will be Easter Sunday, and we'll celebrate it that way. So, but this week we want to focus just for a few minutes on an especially acute problem in our community, which is hunger and food insecurity. And we are dealing with that everywhere. The elderly who can't get out and go to the grocery store themselves because of their vulnerability. school children who 90% of which in DISD rely upon full or partial subsidy of breakfast and lunch every day, and the homeless and the poor generally, many people who are losing their jobs and are now unable to resource themselves. This is a critically important time, and what we're finding is that while many of our helping organizations that deal with food relief are operating at maximum capacity, they're running out as well because of the fact that we waste so much food to begin with, and then we are hoarding food. And so grocery stores and people who have otherwise been taking extra donations to the North Texas Food Bank, now they're being pressed because of people hoarding food and the like. So one of the practical things that we really need to be able to say from our faith communities is that just as you are social distancing or physical distancing to protect other people as a sacrifice, so sacrifice some of what you may have in order that someone may have some also. That is to say, toilet paper, food stuff, you don't have to hunker down for the next 10 years. You need to be thinking about your neighbor when you shop as well. Nancy, I know you've been really looking into what's going on in our agencies locally. What words could you offer to people of specific analysis and suggestion?
Well, I think that, again, we have to redefine what scarcity is and what abundance is, because I think that when we, that I myself have a sense of, somewhat of a sense of scarcity. I can't go to Starbucks anymore and get my coffee when I don't have time to make it in the morning, or, and some of us have been used to thinking about scarcity in those terms. This gives us an opportunity to really identify and empathize with people for whom scarcity means you open up your refrigerator and there's nothing in it, and you don't have money in your purse to go and buy some, and you have children, and you have utility bills, and you have rent to pay, and you need medicine. I mean, this is an opportunity for us to really think about how much do we really need, and what does it mean that some of us can get so much, and so many of us have so little access to what really they need just to be able to live their lives. And these are working people. These are not people who are relying on government handouts, as they're said, so-called. But you can't, people who are working full-time jobs and can't afford to feed their children, who need to rely on the schools for 2 or 3 meals a day, writ large, I mean, this is all of DISD, 90% of DISD. What does that say about us as a society? I think that our faith communities have shown, we know now, how much we've been able to address the problem of hunger in our community through volunteer and through contribution, financial contribution. What we're seeing now is our faith communities need to work on some advocacy so that we do not need to do as much in those realms because people are able to support themselves.
So this is where we move from charity to justice, from the ad hoc helping of one person to the more strategic, systemic restructuring of the way we relate to one another in our society. I do want to say that for those who are wondering how they can help, the North Texas Food Bank has 32 food pantries around the city. And you can go onto their website and find one locally. They do need volunteers. If you are in the not as much at risk category and can volunteer with them, that would be wonderful. Catholic Charities, there's a lot of information online from the city of Dallas and the county about food distribution and the like. And so do a little homework, look on the computer, Google about food and food insecurity and ways to volunteer in Dallas, and you'll be making a great contribution. in that particular case. Omar, anything specifically in your community?
Yeah, so we've had some wonderful organizations, and in my community, I'm very proud of two particular organizations. One of them is Ma'ruf Dallas, which has been doing a lot for particularly the refugees. You talk about empathy and people that are vulnerable right now. I mean, I've had the opportunity to see several people through Ma'ruf Dallas. You talk about a Syrian mother who's a widow and has 5 children, 4 of whom have special needs, does not speak English, and was just bouncing around kitchens to wash dishes and make what she could make to be able to feed her children, and now has no idea what to do if they get sick, has no idea how to take care of herself and her family. You talk about people right now, by the way, that are stuck at home, that are undocumented, that are worried about these ICE raids that for whatever reason have not stopped. And you talk about justice. It is abhorrent that ICE is still doing raids right now,
right,
in the midst of all of this. And they have not just been going after those with felonies on their records. They've been going through these neighborhoods. So I think moving it to a justice part, I mentioned Ma'ruf Dallas, there's ICNA Relief, ICNA, Islamic Circle of North America, which is doing the wonderful work of food pantries and things of that sort. And of course, City Square was not mentioned.
Right.
I absolutely love what City Square is doing. I think we need to help them in the long term. And as you said, move people from the realm of charity to the realm of policy and justice, and just thinking about, what is this going to mean in the long term? Right now we're talking about these checks. After Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, we got $2,000 checks eventually out of FEMA, but that didn't solve the problem. I still think it's a good idea, by the way,
Yeah.
but it didn't solve the problem. What's the long-term solution to poverty? And of course, that includes many layers. And as we redefine scarcity and abundance for ourselves, hopefully we also gain a greater insight into policy and perspective when it comes to changing the long-term conditions of these communities that were already vulnerable before this. So by all means, volunteer, get out there, but get out there and know how you're getting out there. Because one thing I'm concerned about, and I'll end with this, is that as I've been seeing these different organizations carrying out their work in the city of Dallas, everyone is interpreting their hygiene standards and safety standards very differently, right? So social distancing means something very different for each organization.
Mm-hmm.
Do we all get in the same van when we do our food pickups,
Right.
or does everyone ride in their own car? How often do you change your gloves? Are you supposed to wear a mask? None of us want to be cruel to those that we're used to serving. So while some would say drop off the box in front of a door, that feels wrong. So do you knock on the door and then wait a few feet out and just say hi and speak to the person for a little bit? So I think that since this is a long ordeal, hopefully we can also be a part of defining some standards for all of these organizations and charitable efforts that lead to some sort of justice initiative, so that we can know what we're doing.
So I think that creativity is the key here. And when we are serving, when we are sitting in our homes, thinking about others, our neighbors, and the people who are most vulnerable, then we can be creative about how we can serve them. It's not really a choice between justice and charity, it's really both, isn't it? And sometimes what happens is, as people are out there volunteering or giving their money, then what happens is, if they're reflective about it in their practice, then they're asking the questions, Nancy, you asked earlier, and that is, how can we make the most of a crisis beyond this moment? And that is, how can we change our thinking structurally toward long-term change? But getting out there and doing something now is an important part of that.
Yeah, and I just want to, that's absolutely right. I want to emphasize something that Catherine Krause, who's the executive director of the Visiting Nurse Association, said about what's happening with Meals on Wheels, and they still do need volunteers right now for the time being, although with restrictions, they may not be able to use volunteers for that much longer. But she said, that I think 10,000 people a day turn 65, and so they go into that category of seniors who rely on Social Security benefits sometimes for their food, and from the VNA. And if the waiting list continues to grow because they can't provide Meals on Wheels, then who's going to end up with these people? It's the hospital, it's the medical care system.
Right.
That's where they're going to end up. So, it behooves us to think about how we've undermined some of our social safety networks and to our own detriment. Same thing with the Refugee Services of Texas. they're also delivering food to people. But they're also thinking, you know, once this moratorium on rent is lifted, people are going to owe back rent, and these are people who were just getting started in this country. So, you know, we really have to think about what it means to create an economy where people can actually earn a living wage, and where we think about things like SNAP as work support, not as a handout.
If I may, I think it's really refreshing that thus far here in Dallas, faith leaders have been a part of calling, for example, for the moratorium on evictions for 60 days and the delay of rent and things of that sort. So if faith leaders can assert themselves right now and what a moral response to this looks like long term, beyond just writing amongst ourselves or speaking amongst ourselves, then hopefully we can, from now, anticipate those problems and start to envision what that framework is going to look like while working hand in hand with the policymakers, with the leaders. And I think we owe a great deal of thanks to Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins, who's been just wonderful at consulting the faith community, at pulling everyone in the room constantly with our social distancing.
Yes.
Not physically
Right.
pulling us in the room together, but keeping us all in the loop so that we could think about how we move things forward.
Well, and I think it's something Dallas has unfortunately learned about through other health crises. We had the West Nile virus problem, and then we had Ebola. Judge Clay Jenkins was involved in both of those, and he is at the county level in charge of public health. And we've had, I think, really excellent political leadership, as you say, as well, and also from the staff at City Hall and people throughout the city. So we can be grateful for all of those partnerships, and we're seeing movement now in Washington and in Austin to help. We all have to be careful, I think, that we keep a focus on what is helpful and not just making political points during this time, but trying our best to bring people together. And as we conclude, I want to say that's really what Faith Commons is about, bringing people together. We think that our society needs more civil discourse, more conversations with people who don't sacrifice their particular convictions about their faith traditions, but rather bring them into the commons, into the public square, into the places where we're trying to find out how can we help to create a healthier, more flourishing society altogether for all of us to live in. Because while each of our faith traditions builds unique communities, the larger community of God's world altogether is a place we all live. And so Faith Commons is seeking to do that. We're just a 2-year-old organization. You can find us at faithcommons.org, also on the Facebook page. And I want to encourage you to do that. You can subscribe there, and you can check back in with us at 12:12 next Sunday for another conversation like this. But I also want to say, don't hit the donate button on the Faith Commons site right now. That time will come, but right now, we'd encourage you to find those communities, your own faith community, and those nonprofits that you can support that are in such desperate need right now of help, so that we can build a better and more secure life together. Thank you for tuning in to Faith Commons and this State of Our Faith conversation. We'll see you at 12:12 again next Sunday.